Hello and welcome to today's webinar, World Refugee Day, Understanding Refugee Experiences and Improving Services, a presentation by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and Boston Children's Hospital's Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center. I'd like to briefly introduce each of our speakers before we begin. Ms. Saida Abdi is a licensed clinical social worker and a PhD candidate at Boston University. Her focus area is refugee and immigrant populations. She has extensive experience in providing trauma-informed care to refugee and immigrant youth and families. Ms. Abdi is currently an investigator in the largest longitudinal research project undertaken to understand the experiences of Somali refugee youth in North America. In addition, her current role as the Associate Director for Community Relations, Ms. Abdi takes a leadership role in the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center's work with partners around community engagement and integration of cultural and clinical methods to enhance community resilience and system responsiveness to the needs of vulnerable populations. Dr. Molly Benson is a licensed clinical psychologist, an instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School, a staff psychologist and assistant in psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Boston Children's Hospital, and the Associate Director of Refugee Treatment and Services at the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Benson has worked in the field of child and adolescent refugee mental health for over a decade. She has extensive training and experience in providing evidence-based treatment to children and adolescents, applying these interventions in real-world settings, and specific expertise in adapting interventions for refugee children and families. In her current role, she provides oversight and supervision to projects focused on the implementation and dissemination of trauma systems therapy for refugees and the development of refugee-focused resources for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Okay, Dr. Benson, I will now turn it over to you to start the presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us for this webinar in recognition of World Refugee Day. Today, we'll be providing a brief overview of the experience of refugees who resettle in the United States and information that's relevant for providers working with refugees in the United States. The objectives of today's webinar include an overview of who are refugees, an understanding of the refugee experience, including the pre-migration, migration, and post-migration experiences of refugees, cultural dynamics that impact interactions and expectations, barriers to care for youth seeking help who are refugees, the importance of signals of care in schools, service systems, and communities, and resilience in refugee youth and their families. We will begin with the legal definition of who refugees are. A refugee is a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail him or herself of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of persecution. Ms. Abdi will now talk further about refugees.
Thank you, Molly. As Molly said, a refugee is a person who had to leave their country of origin and cannot go back due to fear of being persecuted. There are currently 21.3 million refugees worldwide. Since 1975, the U.S. government has resettled 3 million refugees from all over the world. Approximately 50% of those refugees are children under the age of 18. We want to make it clear that refugees are different from asylum seekers, who are people who do meet the definition of a refugee, but who actually are already in the country in which they seek refuge. Also, an immigrant is someone who may have decided to leave their country of origin and therefore does not meet that requirement of being unable to return, even though there are some immigrants who come here because they are also in fear for their life. Refugees have a status that's, again, different than others in the country in which they seek refuge. In the United States, We have the largest resettlement program in the world. We work closely with the UN, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in order to resettle refugees in the United States, and asylum seekers seek protection upon arrival in the U.S. In this slide, you can actually see the countries of nationality of displaced people in the world. There are approximately 65.3 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. 21.3 million of those have been granted the status of a refugee. This is more than any other time in our history. And you see some of the countries that those people are citizens of in this slide. You can see on this slide, and just talking about the changing face of refugees in the world, and especially in the United States. After World War II, the U.S. began admitting displaced Europeans, so that was the largest number of people who were arriving. In 1948, Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, again continuing to admit people from Europe who were affected by the Cold War. In 1975, the U.S. Refugee Assistance Act allowed increased refugees from countries in Asia like Vietnam. In 1980, U.S. Refugee Act raised the overall number, so you can see a huge spike in the arrivals of the numbers of refugees admitted over time. We can see that there is a variation in changing face of refugees, so that now we have more Africans, more Asians, and also Latin Americans. Close to 85 million refugees were resettled, 85,000, not million, 85,000 refugees were resettled in the United States in 2016, if we just look at the U.S. The highest number of those refugees arriving in the U.S. In 2016 were from the Democratic Republic of Congo, about 16,000. The highest number of arrivals in the past decade were from Iraq. There is really a very uneven distribution of refugees across the United States, so that the states like California, Texas, and New York are taking the most of the refugees, and other states, for example, Arkansas, take very little refugees. This is really important because if you have too many, systems may be overloaded, and if you have too little, there might not be enough people to serve or understand, and then there's more isolation and less services. And so it's important to understand in your state what is the status, how many are there, and how are they being served. A quarter of all refugees who arrived in the U.S. In 2016 were actually settled by those three states that I mentioned before, California, Texas, and New York. And over 50% of all refugees were resettled in only 10 states. So there are states that are taking a lot. 4 countries accounted for approximately a big number, almost 50% of the arrival is actually, and those were the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Burma, and then the 5th country that accounted for the largest number was Somalia. So those 5 countries accounted for a huge number of refugee arrivals in the past year.
As members of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, we are especially focused on the experience of refugee children, youth, and their families. One of the most important things we think to consider when talking about refugee children and their families is understanding the concept of the social ecological model, which was developed by Bronfenbrenner in 1975. This model addresses the complexity of the experience of all children, but especially the experience of refugees. As we look at this model, we can understand that we're looking at a child in the middle, but that the impact of being a refugee affects all levels and layers of their social ecology, so that their family their community, their peer group, their neighborhood, and their culture are all disrupted by the refugee experience. And when we talk about these disruptions, as well as traumatic events that might happen to refugee children and their families, we think about these at different levels of their experience. So we think about the pre-migration experience, which may involve living in a country of origin where there's an ongoing war, or where a family or child faces persecution because they're a member of a certain social group or for other reasons. We also think about the process of migration, during which families often flee, may face separation, may travel for long periods of time on foot without food or water, may also face ongoing violence during that experience. And then we'll talk about the post-migration experience as well. But as you look at this slide, you can see some of the pre-migration and migration experiences that these children face. It can include separation from family, death of loved ones, hunger and exhaustion, violence such as imprisonment, rape, torture, direct exposure to violence or witnessing violence, losing trust in authority figures, as well as the loss of their home, loss of country, and changes then in identity and beliefs or targeting of these identity and beliefs. Once resettled, refugee children and their families can continue to face disruptions in their social environment. They can continue to face traumatic events that may occur in the country in which they're resettled, but they also may face stressors related to adapting to a completely new culture. So when you think about a child being resettled in a new country, such as the U.S., this means disruptions often within their family in terms of perhaps changing roles within the family, changes to who's employed or home with the children, changes in community, adjusting to a new acculturation in terms of new language, new school settings, families learning cultural values and changes within the new community. There may be ongoing resettlement stressors related to things like housing, financial instability, seeking food, and there can be isolation depending on how much social support that a child and their family receives in their area of resettlement. Here at the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center, we tend to think of these post-migration stressors as falling into 4 categories of what we call core stressors that refugees can face when they're resettled in the United States. Some of these stressors are related to the direct experience of trauma, which may have lingering and ongoing effects based on their previous experiences, as well as exposure to trauma here in the United States related to community violence or ongoing violence in the home and other types of trauma. We also think about acculturation stressors, which are related to the whole idea of adapting to a new culture. This has to do with learning a new language, learning new cultural norms. When you think of the experience of children in school, they're often then going between the culture of that school and learning the culture there, and then going back to their home where perhaps their parents may be acculturating in a different way, or their caregivers may be acculturating at a different rate and holding on to more traditional values. This can also strain family relationships within families when there are different types of acculturation. As I mentioned, we also think it's important to attend to resettlement stressors, such as legal stressors, access to health care, financial stressors, and access to basic needs. And in addition, we think that refugees can sometimes face what we call isolation, which may be related to discrimination, loneliness, lack of social support, sense of alienation, and this can vary within one's own cultural group, depending on how much support there is, as well as the town or area in which refugees are resettled here in the United States. As we think about how children adjust to resettling in the United States, as well as adjust to the impact of trauma on their development, one thing that's especially important to consider is that outer circle we were just looking at in the social ecological model, which has to do with culture. We know that culture is important in terms of affecting how people express their emotions, as well as how they may adapt to these stressors and how they may interpret it. So culture affects symptom expression, help-seeking patterns, so who do you go to for help within your community, healing mechanisms, which may have been disrupted by the refugee experience, meaning that's ascribed to trauma, meaning that's ascribed to the symptoms that one might experience post-trauma, as well as how people cope with things in terms of bereavement, the impact of intergenerational trauma, and really the way in which we seek support and the way in which we express our experiences. Culture is important to consider because it also impacts us as providers in terms of how we intervene and provide support to refugees here in the United States. In talking about the experience of refugees, we've mentioned trauma, and we thought that we would briefly talk about the experience of trauma for the developing child. We know that experiencing a traumatic event where a child either directly feels that their life is threatened or they're in danger, or where they witness or hear about these types of traumatic events, can have an impact on the developing child and on their brain development. We know that this impacts people in different ways, but we think that this is an important thing to understand. When a traumatic event occurs, we often think of an important part of the brain taking over called the amygdala. You can see here that the amygdala leads a hostile takeover of consciousness by the emotion. In other words, we have a survival response built into our brain, which helps us survive when a traumatic event occurs. This survival response is quite remarkable. It allows us to adapt to traumatic events when they occur. It might result in experiences during that traumatic event, such as an increase in physiological response, like an increase in rapid heartbeat, a readiness of our body to flee or to fight or to freeze in that situation so that we can survive. This survival response is helpful when a traumatic event is occurring. What we know is that sometimes this response can have some lingering effects, so that when children go through traumatic events, such as those that we know can occur for refugee children, again, pre-migration, during migration, or even post-migration, we know that many of these children will adapt and be quite resilient, but we also know that there can be some lingering effects. And if you look at this slide, you can see that we talk about what's called both the low road and the high road. So that sometimes what we expect to happen is that if there is if let's say there is something in the environment that seems threatening, our brain will process that and either take the low road if there's truly a threat so that that survival response kicks in. But sometimes our brain will slow down, take a minute to take the high road and use that part of our brain that can process the information, slow down and say, this isn't actually a threat, and respond in a different way. What we know can happen sometimes for people who have experienced traumatic events is that that low road can get triggered even when there are no longer ongoing threats in the social environment. So that, for instance, let's say a child who's had to fight for food to survive and has lived in a refugee camp and maybe has faced threats in that situation when they're trying to access food, is suddenly pushed in the lunchroom. That type of trigger could set off a low road response for that child. What we also know is that over time, if that response is triggered over and over, some kids may have some lingering mental health effects that may result in mental health symptoms such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or other behavioral problems or disruptions, sleep disruptions. Despite this awareness, and again, we know that many refugee children and their families go on to lead very productive lives and are quite resilient despite this trauma. But for those that may have some lingering mental health effects, we also know that refugee children are less likely to seek traditional models of care in Western settings such as the United States. And then we know that there are many barriers to seeking traditional mental health care here in the U.S. This may be related to things such as distrust of authority or power, and distrust of systems such as the mental health or medical systems. This can also be due to linguistic and cultural barriers. We know that there's limited diversity and linguistic capability in many health and mental health settings. This can also be related to stigma related to mental health, as well as completely different understandings and explanations for mental health symptoms. And one other barrier can be related to the primacy of the resettlement stressors that families are facing here in the United States. Again, we know that families are dealing with many stressors here in the United States, so that mental health may be not of primacy. It may be more important to seek stable housing, make sure that food is on the table. And so that may lead to less seeking of care for things like mental health symptoms. What we do think is important is that we build mental health responses and supports that address these barriers. And some of the strategies that we think are important are here on the other side of the slide. So things such as community engagement, so engagement with new cultural groups when they move into our communities so that we can build trusting relationships and make providers more familiar. Partnerships with providers and cultural experts so that we're learning to provide more culturally competent and care that has cultural humility and that engages cultural experts who have both the linguistic and cultural knowledge to improve our services. We also know that embedding services within other service systems can be effective so that families may be less likely to seek services, let's say, in a psychiatry department at a hospital, but that if we embed these services in schools or other community settings, they may be more accessible and less stigmatizing for children and families. We also think it's important to go back to addressing the concrete services and needs that families might have. So we've now mentioned the social ecological model a few times. We've talked about the importance of understanding the stressors in a child's social environment. We've talked about these both in terms of how they may trigger a traumatic response for children, but we also know that addressing these concerns and stabilizing the child's social environment can impact both the child's well-being and a family's well-being, but also help for families to see that services are addressing their most important needs at that time. One model, as an example, of mental health intervention that we've developed here at the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center is trauma systems therapy for refugees. And trauma systems therapy for refugees is an adaptation of a trauma-focused intervention, trauma systems therapy. Trauma systems therapy itself focuses on the importance of understanding both a child's own self in terms of their self-regulation following a traumatic event, but also how that interacts with stressors in the child's social environment, and speaks to the importance of addressing both of those things and providing trauma-informed care for children and families. We've adapted this model further to address the many barriers that refugees face in accessing mental health care. So as you can see at the bottom, we've added a tier which is called community outreach. We found that it's important to outreach and form partnerships within communities, again, to build trust and understanding of what services can provide, and also to learn about that community. In addition, we've built a second tier, which are skills-based groups. These skills-based groups were developed for refugee children within a school setting, and we often locate these services within a school setting because, again, we're embedding within service systems that where refugee families may be more likely to seek help and trust services. These skills-based groups were developed for refugee children who have resettled in the United States. They are for all refugee children, not just those who may be facing lingering mental health symptoms, but they're focused on helping children both learn some self-regulation skills that can be important to be used in a school setting, and also to help them with some support around the process of acculturation and that bicultural identity that we know that children face as they enter an American school system and then go home to their families. Through providing these school-based groups, it also provides an opportunity to engage families in schools, to form relationships with them, and then to approach families when there may be some additional concerns about a child enrolled in the group, to provide them with more intensive services, which are, as you can see, the Tier 3 and Tier 4 services as part of trauma systems therapy. These services, again, seek to both provide individual support for a child, but also provide services that focus on addressing stressors and triggers in a child's social environment. When we get up to Tier 4, the safety focus, this is especially focused on making sure that a child's living in a safe environment so that they can recover and grow. On the side of this triangle, you will see one very significant adaptation to trauma systems therapy that we made for refugees. And this is the integration of cultural brokering into all levels of this intervention. And I will now pass this over to Saida to speak more about cultural brokering and the importance of this type of intervention for working with refugees.
Thank you, Molly. As Molly mentioned before, it is really important to build a relationship with the community, to create knowledge and partnership, to partner with communities in order to enhance care. And one of the ways we have done that in our model and we want to share with others and others have done is through the use of cultural brokering. Cultural brokers are professionals who combine intimate community-level knowledge and experience with the understanding of services and institutions in order to facilitate access for cultural minority communities, and improve care. Essentially, cultural brokers are people who are part of those communities that we're working with, who are themselves refugees, who understand what refugee experience is, and who have are trusted. They are gatekeepers. They are people who can serve as a bridge for providers. One of the reasons why this is so important is mental health is such an intimate process that people have to trust us with things that they never trusted with outsiders. And a cultural broker can frame mental health care and needs and illness in a way that is acceptable. For example, in our work, when we are working with school systems and there is a young person who needs mental health services, we don't really, the cultural broker may not use the word mental health. They may talk to a parent about the child's success, the things that are important to the parent, the child's wellness, why the child, this extra help might enhance the child's education. And so a cultural broker understands how to engage, and that's why it's important to use cultural brokers. And often a partnership between, for example, a resettlement agency which has people who serve as cultural brokers because they have to serve communities in the language of origin, and for example, a mental health provider may actually facilitate that access. What cultural brokers allow us to do is to actually understand that culture, to communicate, and also to become, a cultural broker can also educate providers, the provider system. Often we go with services that we think are needed by communities. But in reality, if those services are not connecting with a need identified by the community or by that cultural group that you're working with, and it's not framed in a way that aligns with their values and their understanding of the world, even if it's needed, it's not going to be accepted. And one of the things we really emphasize in that sense, and cultural brokers can help you with, is the idea of cultural humility. We all know about cultural competence, in knowing the community that you're working with, developing an understanding of their ways of being and their ways of understanding the world, and their ways of understanding issues such as mental illness. But it's as important to understand ourselves, to understand our own biases, our own. When I tell someone I am going to do this, what assumptions am I making about them? Cultural humility is a commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, and a recognition that there is a power imbalance, that I am coming with certain power, and that the need is to be aware of that power and to limit that I'm not imposed, to make sure that I'm not imposing my own way of being or seeing the world on my clients. It's also ensuring that whatever we're bringing is something actually that benefits that community and that they see as beneficial. And so there is a whole literature on this, really understanding cultural humility and helps our work, because what it does is it makes us, when we say clients are not accessing, even though services are available, what do we have to change about ourselves? What do we have to change about our own institutions to make them more accessible? One of the things that Molly talked about is those barriers, recognizing what those barriers are, and then making sure that our services are taking into account those barriers. And thinking about implicit bias and our blind spots, our assumptions, of what it means to be healthy, what it means to be a good parent, what it means to be a family. All of those things are part of cultural humility. And again, that takes us to the idea of really understanding. In the beginning, we talked about the number of arrivals, where they're arriving from, where they're going in our communities, really understanding the populations we are serving. What are the specific barriers to care for that population? We worked a lot in our center with Somalis. We are now working with Bhutanese and Iraqis, and our partners are as well. And so each new community that we serve, we really work with those cultural brokers to better understand what are the specific barriers that we should be aware of. And then how can we, again, with that cultural humility, look at ourselves, the way we're providing services, our assumptions, and change those to make the service we are providing more accessible. So barriers such as sometimes there is this service the service they need, or is it what we think we need? So that's one question to ask. Why are people not engaging? Well, who identified this as a need? For example, mental health, as Molly said, may not be the first thing that clients see as their primary need when they are refugees. Their primary need often is actually someone to read their mail because they can't read English and they have all this mail arriving. So if you don't help them with that mail, they may not be wanting to engage in therapy. And so who identified? How do we know what the need is? Is this service connecting with your worldview? For example, in cultures, Somali culture, for example, the idea of mental illness is seen as the child is lost. The child will never recover. The child will never have a future. And so how do we use a language that does not link with that? How do we, again, use a language of hope and positivity? So understanding what is the worldview of the community you're working with and ensuring that the way you're presenting the service and actually the way you're offering the services align with that. And also, if a child, for example, is struggling in school and you think it's because the child has some mental illness or some mental health needs, but actually the parents will say the child is just a bad child, and you're the teacher making him do better. And so is there a different explanatory model? And then the solution may be very different. So how do we come to, I always say we need to share goals, have a common understanding of the goals and the issue before we can actually get to a solution. And so if they have a different explanation for the problem, and then they're suggesting different solutions, it's important to listen to them, and then it's important to work with them to coming to both an explanation that are shared and a solution that is shared. Again, having same understanding of the problem is really important, and also is this service, do they think it's helpful? Are they aware of it? Do they think it's helpful? Cultural linguistic accessibility are really important. And so what are some of the things we can do and we have done in our work? One of the things is that refugees have gone through so much pain that we have to start with hope and love and caring. Sometimes the things we do, how we talk to people, how we approach them, how we explain things may actually give this signal that of disrespect, of not caring, and so we have to be very aware what we're doing and how we are approaching them. Signals of care can be signals of carelessness, meaning that actually if we are not approaching those populations with tenderness that is and caringness that is intentional. I give the example always when they come to the desk, the front desk of a hospital or a clinic, and the way they are treated by the secretary, the tone, the way you are approaching them, the way you are talking to them, may signal for them a disrespect that they have known and may actually trigger that, and in that way they may never come back. And so always being aware and always giving signals of caring and signals, and then danger. You know, when we talk about your child that has an illness, it may actually trigger these memories of danger. And so how do we make sure that we're aware of it and we approach that with a intentionality and carefulness that does not trigger? And just being in your community, if you are not a provider but the refugees live in your community, how do we actually bring love and caring and compassion into their lives that replaces all that hate and fear and persecution that they have experienced? Again, we really talk about those idea of signals of care, which is that people who have known pain and signals of danger, such as refugees, need us to give signals of care and compassion and bring them the idea that you're not in danger anymore. We can communicate those signals through warmth, empathy, and positive regard and respect. You know, often refugees have lost control of their lives, both when they were in the war and also when they're in the refugee camps. So when they're here, to help them take control of their lives, to step back and say, what do you want, and explain what you're offering, and support them, but help ensure that they realize that you're just a help, but their life is now in their hands. And just we need to build a critical mass of signals of care across the system of care, create a social environment that's filled with compassion, with caring, with help. You know, and you can use, if you're a provider, you can use your neighbors. I have done that. You know, the community in which you work, sort of connecting with community leaders and community neighborhoods, and building that compassion and understanding and bringing people together so that they don't see refugees as someone out there, but their brother, their neighbor, their community that are bringing strength and great things to this nation and to their communities. One of the ways that we really would like, we approach this and we suggest for others to approach is actually to ask the questions of, you know, to sort of clarify what we are doing, how we support families, how we support children, how we support refugee communities. And one of the ways we always think about this idea of what is the priority problem. So often, as Molly mentioned before, because of those stressors, families have a million things going on. You know, just paying your rent, getting to all the appointments, getting children integrated into schools, getting a job. All of those things are stressors. And again, those concrete needs have priority over mental health needs. And so talking to families, and actually if you don't do housing, find someone who does. Say, I know housing is, because parents will come to you and say, you know what, all my problems would go away if I had a better housing. And you can't say to them, well, I know that, but that's not really my job. I am a counselor, I'm a therapist. No, it's, yes, I know how important that is, and I'm sure it will make your life much better and will probably take away some of those stresses. So I don't do housing myself, but my friend, my colleague, so-and-so does. And know who those are and make a relationship with the people who do those priority problem things that come to the fore. And so address those. Again, also understand in that culture, the first question we should always ask is, you know, so you're concerned about your child or the school is concerned about your child. Tell me what your other children, how is this child different from your other children? How is this child from other children in your culture? In other words, understanding what it means to be raising concern. Is this child raising concern for you? So coming to a common understanding of what is healthy, what's mental health in the culture, right? So what is the concerning? And is this even concerning for the parents or for outsiders who may not know the culture? And then how do we bring those together? What is the caregiver's understanding of the child's condition or child's needs? Again, is this raising concerns with them? And if not, why not? I give the example of Somali children, very small children, 5 years old. When they go to Head Start or kindergarten, the teachers are coming to me, say, either this child cannot sit down, what shall we do? But I also know the culture, and at home, those children are actually allowed to run freely. And so maybe they're behaving in the way they have always behaved, which to the teachers looks very different. And so how do we work with the teachers and the parents is to change that behavior now that the child is in school, but it may not necessarily be a condition that should raise a concern that's around mental illness or mental health needs. And also, understanding how mental health illness is expressed in the culture, and how do we know when it's happening, what are the symptoms, and what's done, what do you normally do? So what are the health-seeking practices of that community, what is the healing practices, and usually I actually supported those often in the community. When I work with providers and with families, because I know people will be seeking traditional medicine, I know that they're going to go to community healers. I want providers to understand that, and I wanted them to be aware of that happening, as long as it's not something that's harming the child, that's harmful in any way. It's really good so that the parents or the families or the community don't feel like they have to hide these practices from their providers, and for the providers to know. And usually I use a language that says, you know what, the most important thing is for the child to heal. If you want to combine all those different interventions, there is no problem with that. So understanding what other, how mental illness is expressed, and where do you go for help when that happens. And also what has been the family or the child's experience in the systems. This is really important, because if they have already gone to 3 other providers and it has failed, they failed to engage in services, I want to understand why that has happened, and I want to make sure that we're addressing it and we're going to do it different. So understand and tell me where you've gone. What are the things you've liked, the things you haven't liked? Why didn't you go back? Why are you here now? What are the things that made you seek another help? What did you stop? Why did you stop? And again, when, who, and where do people go for help for this type of problem? Like, at what point is it that in many cultures, including the cultures I work with, we work with as a team here, people may wait until the symptoms are so obvious that the person is not able to function. And so just understanding at what point you seek help and from whom is really important. And it's so important, especially cross-culturally, to come to an understanding of expectations, and for the providers to be clear about what they can and cannot do. Because a parent, this is actually one of the most difficult things. A parent or a family may bring a child to a provider with the understanding that the provider is going to cure this illness and that there will be no need for any more medication or follow-up or anything like that. And we know that's not often the case. And so, for example, a chronic illness, any kind of chronic illness may not make sense to some cultures. People think if I'm coming to a doctor, they should be healing, even if it's diabetes or other diseases like that. And so being clear what you're doing and what you're doing, and being understanding what the expectations are, is really important. Again, asking about the pathways to healing in the community is important. I said many of these things, but what's healthy to the caregiver, it's really also important to understand who else is involved in the child's care. It often happens is that there is actually a community of relatives who the parent has to consult with. And so we use this term, who else is in the room with us, and we want to ask the parent, so what are you going to tell those other people who will be making the decision? Especially grandparents are huge decision makers, because often grandparents influence the parents. They may have a veto, actually, over the parents about what to do with a child. And so being really knowledgeable about who else is going to be involved in decision, for example, about medication. You may be talking to a parent who is very willing to engage, for example, with medication, to accept the medication for their child, but they're calling a grandparent in Africa who says, no way, you cannot give that medication to my grandchild. So being aware of that, who else is involved, and working with the parent to develop a language to talk to those people, other caregivers, and if the parents in agreement with you, so that they can make an argument and convince those other caregivers to accept the treatment plan. And sometimes who makes the decision, which is, again, the same. If it's a grandparent who makes the decision within the family, be aware of who that is, and sort of ensuring that you talk about the child's care, the care for the child, with those other caregivers in mind.
Thank you for joining us for this webinar on World Refugee Day. We hope that this information is helpful in your work with refugee children and families who have resettled here in the United States and to your understanding of the refugee experience worldwide. In addition to this webinar, we encourage you to look at additional resources on our website. Included on this website is information about the refugee experience, about the needs in refugee communities, about the experience of trauma for refugee children and their families, as well as specialized sections for providers, including a section for educators and school providers, mental health providers, and primary care providers. Thank you very much.
And that concludes today's webinar, World Refugee Day, Understanding Refugee Experiences and Improving Services. Thank you for viewing this webinar, and thank you, Dr. Benson and Ms. Abdi, for this wonderful presentation.